Perhaps the most hyped card of the last week has been Venus, the card on the Super Premium Season Pass. But how much should you believe that hype? Let's take a look at what Venus can do in Marvel Snap. Venus is a 3-cost, 3-power card with text that reads, when your cards in play are empowered, they get +1 power. For the purposes of this, a card being empowered is getting any green power buff that does not have an ongoing card as its source. Forge is empowering a card. However, Blue Marvel is not. This text does have a lot of interesting applications in more relatively niche decks compared to Jeff, who is definitely a card that strikes me as a little bit more generic. This is a card that is going to additionally stack on top of decks that are already doing these board-wide or repeatable buffs, and is going to be a part of a package that doesn't necessarily have another card that can do what this card does. In other words, it's a force multiplier, but it's only going to be a force multiplier in decks that are not already fully constructed to take advantage of the force multiplication options on the table. So a lot of the decks that you see playing this card are things that have been typically a little bit underserved. For example, the zombie package, the Horde deck, definitely does enjoy playing Venus because it effectively adds +1 every time you hoard anything. That's a very valuable thing to have, and that's a deck that is not chock full of cards that are working with the core in the way that Venus is. So a lot of what Venus is doing is adding another piece to decks that are like 6 core cards, and then they are doing other things on top of that. The more those decks are built around those 6 core cards, the more they love having a 7th piece. And that's sort of a lot of what Venus has been doing in Marvel Snap recently. However, I did knock Jeff for likely not going in the best deck. Whether or not that's a fair thing to knock him for, you can have your own opinions on that. And I think Venus is in a fairly similar situation, where a lot of what she's doing is taking these tier 2 decks and making them slightly better at being tier 2 decks, and that's great, that's awesome. But she is probably not going to go in the best version of the best deck that is doing boost or empower or whatever it's called nowadays. That kind of thing does seem like it's not really her niche just yet. But again, how much of that is her fault and how much of that is just Captain Carter, Prodigy, Mother Ascani, Maverick, Stick, all of that stuff just being not exactly her type of buffing. She is an incremental buffer. The buff decks are not really about that. But the decks that are not the buff decks that happen to be incrementally buffing, they love her. So that's where we're at. This was one of the easiest videos to source decks for, because genuinely what this card is just the absolute overlord of just like weird tier 2 stuff. There's so many cool little things you can do with this card. This one is, of course, an end of turn based combo deck that is trying to rely on the fact that you have a bunch of cards, all of which scale and gain green power the way Venus does. So for example, Marvel Boy will give all those 1 costs an additional +1, and Thena will get an additional +1 when she triggers, and you kind of see where this is going. Your Fantasticar is now doing +3 instead of +2. Maybe you've even prodigied the Venus, because that gives you another thing that you can actually try to prodigy a lot of the time. This is a useful card in this deck, and it really raises the ceiling back up to a point where this is like actually a deck that is meaningfully doing a lot of point output and meaningfully doing some really interesting stuff. And especially by being an end of turn deck, dodging a lot of Shadow Kings on their green power is another really relevant thing that this deck can do. I like it a lot, to be completely honest with you. I got this list from Butt, and this is the best I felt about an Invisible Woman First Steps deck in an extended period of time, because Venus is adding not necessarily a card that's on the level of Invisible Woman First Steps or Jocasta or Prodigy or whatever, not an engine card to this deck, but just a really solid piece that is helpful when you're drawing mid draws, right? This is a card that's going to help you get above the bar for being a functional deck when everything doesn't come together. And I think that role is largely the one that she's going to be celebrated for. A lot of these decks, it's going to be a similar dynamic where it's like, is this the best deck in the game? Maybe not. Maybe it's a lot more tier 2, but this card makes it more consistent and you get more output out of it when it's all said and done by just being a deck that has more good draws. You're raising the floor of your own deck in terms of the output and in terms of how consistently you're going to access that output. And so that's why I talk about Venus as being a card that like looks at these decks that have like 6 core cards, with the notable exception of Captain Carter, because that deck is just sort of not exactly what she's about, but you can't do it. And then says, I will be your 7th. I will be the card that comes in here and helps tie all of this together. And this is, I think, a great example of it. I got this list from Butt, but frankly, it's an end of turn list that anyone could have put this together. One of the best things that the zombie package gets out of this season is the combination of Jeff, who is very good, obviously, with Kitty Pryde, and, of course, Venus, who is extremely powerful when you are getting repeated zombie Scarlet Witches to grow your horde. Each of those zombie Scarlet Witches is a trigger for Venus, and that is a very cool thing. That is a dope interaction, and it's really sick that she gets to just help people out this way. This is another one of those decks where it's like we got 6 core cards, and then the rest of it. And this is a card that is really helpful for reaching the ceilings that we need to reach. But much like the other versions of this deck, there are some things that are pushing Venus down, in my estimation, and ultimately capping the kind of things she can do that are almost entirely all about the Captain Carter stuff, right? It's impossible to talk about a boost deck. It's impossible to talk about a card that involves all this green power without talking about A, Captain Carter, which high rolls higher than you, and B, the fact that all these people playing Captain Carter are dragging the Shadow King players out of hiding, and those decks are also really good against you. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover it now, and then we're going to assume that it's true for everything else we're talking about here, because I don't think I want to say it every single time I talk about a green power deck. So the problem with this deck is largely that it is going to have lower output than the Captain Carter combo decks. That is very straightforward. You can do whatever you want to do to like try to alleviate that, but you are probably going to get outdone when they do their combo, and they do their combo very consistently now. That is a problem. The secondary problem is that in order to deal with that, a lot of people, myself included, have been doing things like Invisible Woman, Shadow King, Grandmaster. That is also incredibly potent against you if you are a Venus deck that is trying to stack up a bunch of green power. Very, very, very bad to see. So those dynamics are the things that are pushing Venus down. But if we just talk about this deck as a deck, there have definitely been metagames in which this would be a very powerful deck. We don't happen to be in one of those right now, but we have had them before, and Venus is helping this package out in a real way. Venus does some cool stuff with a lot of scalers. This is much more a deck that is cool and much less a deck that I think has a ton of serious potential, but it's a really cool thing to be able to play this and actually have some additional power here. Angela back to +2, Bishop getting +2, Elsa giving +3. This is all super dope. This is all stuff we actually love to see. And again, like we've been in metagames where it's like, this is the kind of thing, like this is an engine card. It would really work. We get like Jeff to give +2. Kitty Pryde does her thing in hand. It's confusing, but like you see what I'm saying? Like you put the Kitty on the Jeff, it'll be fine, right? You get a lot out of this, right? This is a deck that I think, again, in other metagames would be a really legitimate contender. The point output here is really solid, and this is what I mean when I talk about Venus just going in all these green power decks and making them better and just really giving some additional like boosts, no pun intended, to these kind of lists while ultimately not fundamentally changing what they are. These are still tier 2 and below. Like, they might have gone from tier 3 to tier 2. I think this deck, very reasonably, you could argue, got a really big boost from Venus, but it's still going to be an off-meta pick. And I think that that is ultimately the thing that's driving me a little bit nuts about Venus, where it's like, she takes all these decks and she makes them better, but she definitely doesn't make them to the level of being the best deck in the game, to the level of competing with the best deck in the game, to the level of being like serious, I would take this to the Golden Gauntlet kind of stuff a lot of the time. And she makes it like more acceptable to do it. It's no longer like a joke. If you told me like I'm taking an Angela Bishop deck to the Golden Gauntlet previous, now I'd probably be laughing at you. But now it's like, okay, I mean, it's not great, but I understand where you're coming from. And that does matter. And I think that's the important part of what I'm trying to convey here is like, we're in a pretty awkward metagame right now because of how ridiculous the top end stuff can be. And if that wasn't happening, I think this card would be seeing a lot better reception, kind of the way I feel about Jeff the Baby Dolphin. If you want to play like an unbelievably fair buff deck that does get some real benefit from Venus, I think this is a great direction to go. But again, the problem you run into is unbelievably fair, dies to Shadow King, dies to the Carter decks. But this is, again, like there's so much cool stuff here, man. The Marvel Boys stuff is so sick. Like there's actually like, I'm not saying I'm going to be like super sold on this, but like Marvel Boy and Venus and Cleo when Submariner comes out, there's like things there that are like fairly compelling to me, even if they are relatively low ceiling. And fundamentally, that's kind of the issue that I've been identifying this whole thing, which is Venus is really cool, but fundamentally low ceiling. This is a card that is scaling linearly in a world where the best deck is scaling multiplicatively. And that's really just all there is to it. And I think that this is a really cool deck and a really cool concept, and a bunch of really interesting stuff is going on here, but ultimately it will get outputted by the other things in the space. And it's also a good segue to talk about playing Venus in the Surfer list, because there is some argument for that as well. The argument mostly being that Venus Surfer is just like a very reasonable limp line that you can apply here. Like, this is probably going to be worse than playing, you know, the stock version with Storm. It's probably just going to be worse than that, because you're doing, that deck is just a little bit better doing hand buff stuff. You want to start doubling it too. All of that is true. You have Storm, and then you have Mother Ascani to like double that, and Venus doesn't work on stuff in hand. And again, all of it is true, right? But, and this is important, it's probably a lot harder to mess up with this deck. It is a lot harder to mess up playing this kind of deck. You need to know a lot less about the specific interactions. You have a lot more room to be wrong about things and just play it like a Surfer deck and still beat people. And I think that's a really important thing for a lot of people to have. This is sort of, in my conception, the Doom 2099 of Surfer decks, where like, even if you get to a point where people at High Infinite will be like, the other one is better, you still can say like, look, man, I'm not playing against anyone who's playing the other one, and I'm not playing against anyone who's playing the other one, quote unquote, correctly the way you guys are all saying it is, right? And I think that that's a very reasonable argument. Like, I don't think this is the end of the world. I think it's like 90% as good as the Storm version. I just think that when you're talking about a serious competitive environment, being 90% as good as another deck, that's actually a bad thing, right? Like, that's like a almost disqualifying thing when you're playing in a hyper competitive environment. But if you're playing like, I just want to bang out 6 hours of ladder, and I just want to play a deck that is low downside, and I'll always be doing my thing, and my upside is there, but I don't have to think too hard, and I don't have to worry too much about it, and I know how to play it, this is a very viable alternative. You might be a little bit surprised, but Aurora has just a lot of weirdly good overlap with this Venus card beyond just the card Aurora itself. Like, when you really zoom in here, you get additional points on Sam Wilson. Sometimes you'll get additional points on Herbie. Sometimes you'll get additional points on Awesome Andy, on Drax, on Iska, on Thing First Steps, on Aurora herself. There's actually a lot more of it than you'd think. And I think that Aurora is particularly a deck that is in search of ceiling. My big worry for Aurora is more, does its shape fit the metagame as it is? Like, in as much as I have worries about Venus Aurora, they're much more about the shape of Aurora compared to, say, the shape of a deck playing Cosmo Juggernaut, right? Like, that kind of thing, like the move deck playing Cosmo Juggernaut, the fact that you have to turn 6 your Aurora makes your Cosmos worse in a really appreciable way. And so I think that, like, while it is good that we're getting some additional points here, it is good that there's like more beef in this deck, because Aurora needs beef. That's a really important aspect to this deck, is like the thing that prevents it from being viable a lot of the time as a baseline. The first check it has to pass is, do you have enough points? And it's really good to get cards that actually help you pass that check. The other thing, though, unfortunately, is that even if you get those things that help you pass that check, and that's great, and I love it, and it's the coolest thing in the world, but does the concept of playing a 6-on-6 make sense right now? And that's the part that I'm a little bit more iffy on. But Venus in this deck has seemed pretty solid. Last up, a list from Butt that is taking a lot of the principles we've talked about in this video and trying to make them real in a way that maybe not a lot of people have been thinking about. So of course we have blowing up a Nova for +2 power on everything. That's pretty sick. But Weapon X getting some additional power when it scales up, also very sick. Wolverine getting some additional power when you blow it up, very sick. Zombie Captain Marvel getting some additional power when she blows things up. You get where I'm going with this. Just some a little bit of a maybe a thing that people aren't too 100% on, where it's like, oh, okay, this is really cool. I'm gonna do some small repeated empowers. One of the cards that's the best at doing repeated empowers is Weapon X, and I think that that's a really interesting dynamic for people to explore. Not that this is particularly going to be like the thing that juices it into the metagame. It has all the same problems that every other package that we've talked about has in terms of how they fit into the metagame. But I do think that, like, in search of, I would like to get some repeatable empowers so that I can get maximum output on Venus, a lot of people probably have forgotten about our boy Weapon X, who does do some real work here. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. And let me know what you think of Venus. Right now, I think she's probably going to be a super appealing card because all the strategies I described are things people love doing, even if they're not necessarily going to be meta. And I don't know that I think she's going to be meta, but I do think I'm going to see her around because she's going to be in all these tier 2 decks and sort of on aggregate, she's just going to start showing up places. And I think that's a really interesting shape for a card to take. So let me know what y'all think. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.